This is another episode of Spectacle on Television Nigerian today, and we will be looking generally on African politics and democracy, especially as practiced in Africa. Are we still nascent in our democracy, or we are good to go? Are we moving with the speed, in equivalent speed with the first world countries, or we are still lagging behind? Shortly, I'll be introducing to you a professor of political science at the Northern University of Iowa, United States of America, Professor Pita Agbese. Welcome to Spectacle.
Thank you very much, Engineer.
Thank you, sir. Prof, I want you to tell us what is the problem of African democracy.
There is a number of ways we can look at it. One, from a very optimistic perspective, which is what I like to do, is to say that 20 years ago, only very few countries in Africa could be categorized as democratic. Today, most countries in Africa have popularly elected governments. And so Africa is a far cry from what it was a decade ago, 2 decades ago, in which the military dominated politics on the continent. So on that hand, we can say the continent is making some progress. However, most countries in Africa, people have not yet derived what we refer to as the dividends of democracy. They have not had good governance, even though now we have democratically elected governments instead of military dictatorships. But the economic lives of most people on the African continent have not improved marginally. So on that ground, we can say democracy, yes, but dividends of democracy, we are yet to attain those.
And of course, dividends of democracy is one of the joy of democracy itself. Democracy is freedom. And do you see this libertarian society in African democracies right now?
Oh yes, definitely. The fact that most Africans today get to elect their leaders is a very good improvement over the situation of the current past. But as I said, this has not really translated into major improvement in people's conditions of existence. But just the mere fact that today Africans themselves decide who their rulers are, it's something that we have to applaud.
Is a step forward.
It is definitely a step, not just forward, but in the right direction as well.
Okay, Prof, you're a professor of political science. How do you generally see African politics with respect of this incessant, truncating of democratic government by military juntas, especially in part of West Africa?
Well, if we again take a look back historically, West Africa used to be the hotbed of military dictatorships. In fact, of the 16 countries on the West African sub-region, only Senegal has not had any experience of military coup and military rule. But again, if we look at the current situation, there is hardly any country in the West African sub-region that can no longer be categorized as a democratic country. So that is good. But we also have to take into account the background to military coups and military dictatorships on the African continent. Some of it has to do with the colonial background that most African countries have gone through. It also has to do with the weaknesses of democratic institutions. And we also cannot discount the personal greed of some military officers who saw coming to power via coup as the way to enrich themselves. But again, as I said earlier, fortunately, that's no longer the trend. Military rule has become the exception rather than the rule on the African continent. So that's something to be applauded.
All right. Talking about West Africa and Africa generally, our nascent democracy, do you see the constitution with reference to that of Nigerian constitution a colonial byproduct?
Well, a constitution, it simply means by which a society decides how it governs itself, how power is apportioned. There are various ways in which constitutions can come into existence. One is where it can be imposed by fiat, by military dictatorships or some other types of dictatorship.
Yes.
The other method is where the people freely decide what goes into the constitution. We have had a mixture of both on the African continent. For the most part, constitutions in Africa are those imposed by military and other forms of dictatorships. But on the other hand, we have had instances where through what in political science we refer to as a process-led constitution making, in which the people themselves decide what goes into the constitution. The current constitution in Ghana is a good example of that. The constitution of Ethiopia, Eritrea, are examples of process-led constitution making, in which it is the people themselves who decide through consultation, through constitutional conferences, through mass participation in the whole process, decide what ultimately goes into the constitution. With reference to Nigeria, that was not the experience.
Yes.
It was the constitution we are operating on, the 1999 constitution, was imposed by military fiat.
Yes.
We've been trying to make important amendments on this constitution, but there are still so many areas of the constitution that have marred the practice of genuine democracy in this country. For example, the constitution includes a provision providing immunity for governors, so they cannot be sued. But ironically, governors, even though cannot be sued, they can sue others. And that's an anomaly. You don't have a situation in which somebody has immunity that immunes that person against being sued, and yet that person has the legal capacity to sue other people. It's wrong.
An irony and a very big anomaly to me.
It is.
And some of these governors are banking on this constitution, committing heinous crimes, taking, for instance, the local government funds that used to come to their joint account. Do you have anything to say about it? Because it is a criminal offense and they cannot be sued.
Yeah, normally what the Constitution will provide is immunity for governors or president, for example, in the United States, while they are in office. So that the logic is that you don't want them to be disrupted by having to go to court to be answerable to various charges. But usually that doesn't apply to criminal offenses. And so you don't have it in other countries, you don't have a situation where a president or a governor has immunity against criminal offenses. That is incorrect. That is not right. You shouldn't have a situation where a governor or a president has total immunity. That immunity should only apply to the course of the official performance of the role of a president or as a governor. But if a governor or a president commits a crime, why shouldn't that person be criminally prosecuted?
Exactly. Now, back to the issue of constitution still. This issue of Nigerian constitution, especially where a lot of anomalies are ongoing and we cannot just oppose through the court of law or through wherever. Do you see this same constitution fighting against the institutions of democracy, especially like the judiciary?
Well, the constitution should be a living document. It's not just what is there in black and white, but how it is put into practice, how it is challenged by ordinary citizens, so that the courts can then interpret what the provisions of the Constitution say. So if you don't do that, the Constitution becomes a dormant document, and a dormant document is of no use politically. So a Constitution has to be a living document. It has to be challenged. It has to live up to expectations. If it is not living up to expectations, then you need amendment. But if you have serious anomalies in the Constitution, that impairs the working of the political system, particularly in a democratic system. You don't want a situation where the Constitution itself becomes an instrument for hampering democratic progression.
Exactly. And do you see the Nigerian Constitution, ripe enough to be amended to suit democratic tenets?
Oh yeah. See, every Constitution has the capacity to be amended. you have to look into what are the provisions for amending the constitution. In some cases, those are very rigid requirements, so that the constitution does not become a document to be trifled with. In other cases, you make the amendment so simple, so straightforward, that anytime there are difficulties that are not foreseen when the constitution was written, then you can take care of those situations that were not foreseen, and therefore that's why you have amendments. And so when the constitution is no longer living up to expectations, then it needs to be amended. The Nigerian constitution can be amended. The critical question is what is there to be amended? What are the critical issues that have arisen in the 20 years since this democratic system was put in place in 1999 that shows that the constitution needs to be amended? And I can suggest several. Okay. One of them is the one we talked about just a moment ago, the immunity that governors have. That, to me, is a blanket check for the governors to commit atrocities. And you cannot have a political situation where the rulers themselves are immune from being held accountable.
Which means they are lawless.
Right. And then another thing that I would want to see...
Or they could be lawless. Of recent, they threatened to take the FG to court on the ground that they were being stopped from accessing local government funds.
That in itself, it's not being lawless.
Okay.
While I disagree with that, I think they have the constitutional right to go to court and say the federal government is overstepping its bounds. So to me, that's normal, and that should be encouraged.
For a good reason. You are stealing some fund from local government coffer. You are not implementing the fund for what it meant. And you are being stopped from stealing. And you say you are going to court so that the court will allow you to steal. Do you see any infringement to that?
No, because in principle, if you are operating a federal system, which we are, the state governors can go to court and say, look, the federal government is overstepping its bounds. Call the federal government to order. As I said, I don't necessarily agree with taking the government to court over the local government finances. But in principle, the state governments and even the federal government should be allowed to challenge the other governments at the other levels.
Okay.
That's how you make a system work well.
Okay. Now, in this administration, second tenure of President Muhammadu Buhari, with reference to what the policies, some of the policies he has made, enacted, and ongoing, what agenda would you want to set for him?
It's not for me to set an agenda for the government. Fortunately, in a democracy, the government, after a period of 4 years, as is the case in Nigeria, can come back to the electorate and say, have we done a good job? Do we deserve to be re-elected? And the electorate can pass a judgment. Now the government could say, if you re-elect us, this is what we want to do. We want to provide more jobs. We want to improve security. We want to make the economy work well. Do you approve of this? If the voters say, yes, we do, the government gets re-elected. And then once the government gets re-elected, then it should be held to abide by the promises it had made during the campaign. So I will say, as a citizen, what I will do is not to set a new agenda for the government, but to say, when you were campaigning for re-election, these are the things you promised to do. Now we want to hold you accountable to providing those things that you promised to do to fulfill all the promises you have made.
Okay, in the United States of America, we have 4 years single tenure for elective office. And in Nigeria too, we have 4 years single tenure. Don't you see Nigeria as nursing, very, very nursing in democracy to have copied this simple or single 4 years tenure? I mean, 4 years for a single tenure. Because the angle I'm driving at is, do you see 4 years as too little to enact and implement some policies because of the factors of the way we practice politics in this Africa, this part of the world?
Well, in democratic theory, one of the issues is to say how long a tenure do you want a government to be in power? And the fear is that if you extend the tenure for too long a period, so many terrible things could happen that the voters will have no check on. So if you make it 4 years, 4 years governments can implement so many things. If the government turns out to be a terrible government, within 4 years it can be thrown out. So I don't think 4 years by itself are necessarily too long or too short. It depends on what things you want the government to be able to accomplish. And I think 4 years should be long enough for any government to accomplish anything.
But
meaningful.
we are not in the first world country. We are third world. If America is having 4 years with their decent democracy, should we also imbibe with these 4 years? Don't you see it as too little?
Well, technically, it is only the president who has a 4-year tenure at the federal level in the United States.
Okay.
Now, for members of the House of Representatives, their tenure is only 2 years.
Okay.
They have to submit for re-election every 2 years.
Okay.
Now, for the senators, it's actually every 6 years. And so it's only the president who serves a 4-year term.
And in Africa?
Well, in the Nigerian case, we have a 4-year term for all the elected offices.
Yes.
Now, it has not caused a problem, but it's possible that in the future, where you have everybody having a 4-year term, you are going to have a problem because you may not have continuity in governance.
And most of them, upon inception, what they think about is planning how to be re-elected immediately.
That's always the case where you have tenureship. And so it's not peculiar to Nigeria. In the United States, members of the House of Representatives, members of Congress, members of the Senate, they are also so much interested in being re-elected that their focus is on being re-elected.
And do you see a factor of this determination or enthusiasm for being re-elected militating against governance, comparing that of the United States to we here in the African continent?
And not necessarily.
Okay.
See, the issue is, has those who have been elected, have they done enough to deserve being re-elected? Okay. So we allow the electorates to make that determination.
Now, thank you, Prof. You brought my attention to another thing because of what you just said now. Sometimes our electoral systems, I don't know, do you see our electoral system to be genuine and competitive in comparison with that of the United States, the first world countries where we borrowed this democracy from?
I would say yes. The Nigerian electoral system is actually more competitive than the United States system.
Okay.
Statistics indicate that over 80% of members of Congress who seek re-election get re-elected.
Okay.
The turnover rate in Nigeria is much, much higher than that. We don't have an 80% success rate for those who seek re-election getting re-elected. So on that count, I would say we're actually a step above the United States.
Okay.
Our electoral system is actually more exciting.
Okay.
It's less predictable than that of the United States.
Okay.
So that's good.
Okay, what about the issue of development, infrastructural development, and social amenities? Could you say that we are out of basic social amenities in this country?
Oh, no. I wouldn't say that at all. Because even though we have made some progress politically, we have not made much progress economically or in the standards of living.
Okay.
I wrote something a few weeks ago about our quest for moving forward.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that sometimes we have to ask ourselves, just as Professor Alubo of University of Jos did a few years ago, what will it really take for us to move backwards? And if you look at it, for people of my generation, I will say if we were to move back to what it was when we were growing up, life was much better, much simpler.
You think so?
Yes, I think so, in so many respects. One of the examples I used to give, when I graduated from university in Nigeria in 1978, you needed just 2,500 naira to buy a Volkswagen Beetle car. 2,500 naira. I paid the rent of 50 naira a month for a one-bedroom apartment in Sokoto.
But the value compared to now?
Well, it's still the same Volkswagen Beetle.
Okay.
So, in fact, one could even say maybe the Volkswagen Beetle of the 70s was technically superior to the Volkswagen Beetle now. But nobody will sell even a tire of a Volkswagen Beetle to you today for 2,500 naira. And so what do you call progress when if 2 decades ago you could buy a Volkswagen Beetle for 2,500 naira and today you need over 1 million naira to buy the same vehicle? That's not progress to me.
And do you see it as democratic problem?
It is not a democratic problem per se. It's inability of us to use our resources to improve the living standards of our people.
Thank you, Professor Peter. We'll be stopping here today. When I need you again, I hope I will have the privilege of bringing you here again.
It will be my pleasure to do so.
You're welcome, sir.
Thank you, Engineer.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
That was Professor Pita Agbese analyzing African and especially Nigerian politics and democracy. I am your host once again, Daniel Atai. Thank you for watching.